Greetings. My name is Stan Prager from the Regarp book blog, www.regarp.com. Today's podcast features my review of Before the Storm, Barry Goldwater, and the Unmaking of the American Consensus by Rick Perlstein. Quote, "We are proud of and shall continue our far-reaching and sound advances in matters of basic human needs, expansion of Social Security, broadened coverage and unemployment insurance, improved housing, and better health protection for all our people. We are determined that our government remain warmly responsive to the urgent social and economic problems of our people. That men are created equal needs no affirmation, but they must have equality of opportunity and protection of their civil rights under the law." End quote. Can you guess which American political party once championed these ideals? The Democrats? Wrong. Those are in fact excerpts from the Republican Party platform that saw Dwight David Eisenhower coast to re-election in 1956, the year before this Sputnik baby was born. Moreover, such was the prevailing consensus of the day that those identical planks could seamlessly have been dropped verbatim into the platform of Ike's Democratic opponent, Adlai Stevenson. But that was then, and this is now. Today's MAGA Republicans would denounce it all with a pejorative flair as Marxist, socialist, woke. How did we get here? In Before the Storm, Barry Goldwater and the Unmaking of the American Consensus, published more than 2 decades ago, acclaimed historian Rick Perlstein identifies with an eerie prescience the origin of many of the ingredients that manifest today's alt-right MAGA, while looking back to locate the first fractures in a bipartisan accord that now strikes as almost unimaginable. Once upon a time, a handsome, square-jawed, tan figure with chiseled features stepped out of the panorama of Frederick Jackson Turner's mythical western frontier, in this case Arizona, to demonstrate to America how it should be done. He could sometimes be seen on horseback, sporting a Stetson, gripping the stock of a rifle, or more often, to recast the romance in a modern era, flying his own plane, a passion born of his service as a pilot in World War II. Part of his legend was that he had pulled himself up by his own cowboy bootstraps, but that was hardly accurate. In truth, he inherited and once managed his family-owned department store. He later entered Republican politics and eventually went to the Senate as an anti-New Deal crusader. At one time identified as the nation's leading conservative, he clung to a complicated, deeply nuanced ideology that blurred the lines between states' rights, libertarianism, federalism, and social justice. A lifetime member of the NAACP, he denounced racism, desegregated his own business, and acted as prominent advocate for integration in professional, educational, and civic circles, yet became nationally identified as a fierce opponent of civil rights because he objected to federal enforcement. That, as well as his hawkish anti-communism and uncompromising fiscal conservatism, placed him on the extreme right of the political spectrum. Yet, despite his distance from the mainstream, he became the Republican nominee for president in 1964. A warm personality offstage that frequently wore the face of a curmudgeon in public life, he polarized twin audiences that viewed him alternately as a genuine American patriot or a dangerous demagogue. And he happily played to those strengths and weaknesses in his acceptance speech at the convention, proclaiming against the counsel of virtually every advisor that extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice, and moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue. Words that went on to launch the campaign that led to a landslide loss for Barry Goldwater. But Goldwater's not actually the star of Before the Storm. That role goes to Cliff White, the otherwise anonymous character who was the genius in grassroots organization that brought conservatives both out of the woodwork and out of the wilderness, eventually driving the 3-year effort behind the draft Goldwater committee that won his man the nomination, only to be overlooked and cast out of the inner circle once the campaign was underway. And here it is that Perlstein truly shines, articulately revealing the behind-the-scenes slow dance that quietly yet oh so elegantly drew unlikely, even dissimilar partners from various corners to the main floor, where steps, at first disjointed, were neatly choreographed to move in unison. The result was a spectacular production, unlike anything ever seen before in American politics. When the credits ran, Cliff White's name was conspicuously absent, but it was indeed his show. It would be a disservice to the reader to overlook the fact that some parts of the tale Perlstein tells of this back-of-the-room maneuvering runs to tedium. I recall the minutiae contained in one particular chapter of small print that became almost too much for me. More than once I closed the cover to mindlessly scroll my phone. But this is a rarity in what is, after all, a very thick volume, and Perlstein writes so well that I read hundreds of other pages with rapt attention. And it was much later that I grudgingly acknowledged that despite the temptation, I was grateful that I actually read rather than skimmed that very chapter. As with the plot of a fine, intricately crafted novel, it turns out that everything Perlstein shares is critical info eminently essential to the larger narrative. How challenging the landscape was for Goldwater, and how accomplished was Cliff White in boosting his candidate to the lead is made abundantly clear by the early front-runner he replaced, liberal Republican and New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller, his political opposite, although part of that was achieved with the unforced error that begat Rockefeller's self-destruction when he divorced his wife to then wed a much younger woman, a misstep unforgivable in the eyes of the early 1960s electorate. Still, it was a long journey from Rockefeller's politics to Goldwater's, and White deserves extraordinary credit for coalition building out of the fragmented disaffected who comprised the edges of what truly became the conservative movement that flocked to Goldwater's standard. One significant element was a kind of rabid, hyperbolic anti-communism that was the legacy of McCarthyism, but amplified by both the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis, that manifested itself in a variety of conspiracy theories that tickled the tips of mainstream America's very real paranoia in the grips of the existential threat of nuclear annihilation, while simultaneously fueling quite a number of lunatic fringes. What they all had in common was the unshakable belief in the Machiavellian genius of Soviet leaders like Khrushchev, to clandestinely impose communism upon the United States so brilliantly and completely that the public would be unaware of the menace until it was already too late. There are echoes of this in the 1956 sci-fi horror movie Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which has friends and family duplicated by pod people. The most visible on the fringes was the John Birch Society, which held that U.S. sovereignty was secretly being usurped and replaced by a shadowy world government installed by an international communist intrigue enabled by the Council on Foreign Relations. Their own fellow traveler was Major General Edwin Walker, who attempted to indoctrinate American active duty troops along these lines. A satirical fictional persona of this stripe takes the form of the clearly unhinged General Jack D. Ripper in Stanley Kubrick's film Dr. Strangelove, who also warned of the dire threat to our precious bodily fluids posed by fluoridated water. A stark reminder today that voices like those of now Cabinet Secretary of Health and Human Services Robert F. Kennedy Jr. were once widely ridiculed by mass audiences. This well predated the presidency of John F. Kennedy. Indeed, conspiracy theorists insisted that not only key members of the Eisenhower administration, but Ike himself were covert communists. But JFK was to become the flashpoint as he became associated with the other burning issue igniting right-wing outrage, civil rights. A cautious moderate with finely honed political instincts, Kennedy had hoped to postpone taking a public stand on desegregation until after his re-election, which depended upon the support of the solid Democratic South. But he was dragged reluctantly into the moral crusade when he could no longer avert his eyes from the brutality Southern cops inflicted upon peaceful protesters. His nationally televised call for the Civil Rights Act of 1963 was simply too much for segregationists and others on the right who already judged Kennedy soft on communism. Shoring up a now shaky base was part of what brought JFK to Dallas that November, where he was greeted by wanted for treason flyers created by an associate of General Walker. "We're heading into nut country today," he confided to Jackie on the last morning of his life. In spite of Kennedy's assassination, extremism remained an unwelcome fringe in American life. For his part, Goldwater mourned Kennedy, a good friend despite their policy differences, whom he'd looked forward to taking on in '64. And it was not like the Republican Party Cliff White was retooling, was openly welcoming the Birchers and diehard segregationists into its ranks, but neither was it loudly denouncing them when they came calling either. More importantly, these angrier, if loonier, voices had tapped into a widespread twin populist discomfiture among an increasingly disenchanted portion of the electorate. Perhaps, many wondered, Soviet communists were getting the better of us after all. And, equally important, a deeply racist United States, South and North, was no more ready to embrace equal opportunity for black Americans in the 1960s than it had been in the 1860s. Then there were the old-school anti-New Deal conservatives, sent off to the back of the bleachers when a cleverly contrived rules change over seating delegates in the 1952 Republican National Convention marginalized their leader, Robert A. Taft, and brought Eisenhower the nomination and the White House. Finally, moderate Richard M. Nixon had lost the 1960 election only very narrowly. His disappointed supporters simply needed to be reminded of brand loyalty to keep them within the fold. Cliff White had a keen eye for all these potential voters, and likewise recognized that many of them resided in states where the Republican Party had such little presence that it had never been in play as a political force. Then White went to work, assiduously cultivating a grassroots movement that neatly stitched all these elements together. Of course, in the end, it was all for naught, or at least it seemed at the moment. In a time when the threat of nuclear Armageddon was a part of everyday kitchen table discourse, Goldwater's own words at the convention and on the stump branded him as an extremist. "In your heart you know he's right," a rallying cry by Republicans, was wickedly mocked by opponents with the snarky riposte, "In your guts you know he's nuts." Goldwater was hardly laughing when he was crushed at the polls. Prognosticators, prematurely of course, declared the Republican Party dead, at least as far as obtaining the presidency was concerned. After the long reign of FDR and Truman, perhaps the Eisenhower years were just an aberration. In any event, the lesson seemed clear. The fringe right managed to claw its way to the top and, predictably, went down in flames. The future for Republicans, if a future was even conceivable, was a return to the center. But while those fringes were roundly chastised by the buttoned-down forces of reason seeking to reclaim the party, somehow, either by negligence or design, they were never effectively ostracized. Instead, neither welcomed nor exiled, they remained, lurking, quieter perhaps, but no less committed to their respective causes. They would, as we would find out, make alliance with others even more extreme and gravitate to the top once more. Rick Perlstein is a progressive author and historian whose life's work has been given to chronicling the rise of the right in modern American politics. Before the Storm is the first of a sequential chronology that to date includes Nixonland, the Invisible Bridge, and Reaganland. But I started in the middle, and have been mostly reading Perlstein backwards. When I mentioned that as an aside in my review of Nixonland, the author sent me a sarcastic email offering to send me an essay he wrote in middle school. Perlstein's a funny guy, but there's nothing humorous about the account that unfolds in his several books describing the way the tentacles on the outer fringes of the right gradually crept towards the center of the Republican Party and began strangling the creatures within that once represented a rather broad diversity of thought, stripping them of legitimacy until the only rightful heir remaining was attached to a rigidly ideological brand of conservatism. It did not happen right away. There were reverses and retreats, but each of these steps back yet left an indelible mark, and the bits of debris that collected from carving those marks coalesced into building blocks, and those in turn became structural forms that took on so much weight that they cracked the foundation of the party of Abraham Lincoln and Theodore Roosevelt, and yes, Dwight Eisenhower, finally demolishing the central pillars that had defined the GOP for decades upon decades and supplanting it with a brand new edifice constructed upon tenets of self-righteousness that was increasingly intolerant of dissent, disdainful of compromise, and driven by the pursuit of power for power's sake. All of that is clear now, in retrospect, with the strangulation complete, as the forces of the alt-right have entirely subsumed the Republican Party, now transmogrified into today's grievance-driven, anti-democratic MAGA cult of personality for Donald Trump. Pundits yet still scratching their collective heads in an attempt to analyze how the GOP got here should first be admonished that, given its history, the dystopia of Trump world is perhaps not the aberration all too many assume. And then they should be referred to before the storm. Perlstein had already lived through Ronald Reagan and Newt Gingrich when that book went to print at the turn of the millennium. So although well aware of the trends, he could not have known for certain what really lay ahead. But man, he sure was onto something. Thank you for joining me for today's podcast. I encourage you to share it in your network. Many more reviews and an eclectic array of fiction and nonfiction books are available at regarp.com and regarbbookblogpod.com. Have a great day.